Thank you very much for that very flattering introduction, Kim. And nice to see everybody here today. And I'm excited about this conference in general. And greetings to our colleagues across the Atlantic Ocean. And hope everyone is doing well today. I'm going to be talking to you this morning about how we frame climate language. And I've got a lot of detail here. I may even remove a few of my slides that are overly nuanced just to make sure we have good time for question and answer. Started. Just a couple of things, and I see this as good news. So the Pew Research Center over the last couple of years has come out with a lot of findings from surveys they've given people about in daily life, including attitudes about climate change. And fortunately, even though climate change very hard, we all fight for it, we're all worried about it. Worldwide, people are becoming more and more concerned with climate change, which is good. We got people thinking about it. 75% out of 19 countries see it as a major threat, to their own countries. And in the US, where I'm from, only 54% that felt that way, but that's an increase. Things are gradually going in the right direction. And as many of you probably know, or you might suspect, there could be even more, but there's political, different political attitudes that get in the way sometimes. And some groups worldwide feel even more strongly that climate change is a major threat, including younger people. Younger people in general are more open to this idea. They're more likely to want to do something about it. And women as well in general. And then educated people post-baccalaureate and higher. But that makes sense. They know more about it and have learned about it in school and so on. And worldwide, 64% of all people believe climate change and other large-scale problems can be solved. How? By working together. And that's the big challenge. And I'll talk a little bit about that today throughout, or kind of touch on it in what I'm going to say about language. So the problem here, colleagues, is that the way we think, or the way we talk about climate change, a lot of different ways to talk about it, affects how we think and what we do about it. That's also, I'm going to give you a preview. That's how I end my talk too, as I say, that's also the solution. So the way that we talk about language greatly affects what we do about it. That's what this talk will touch on throughout. Okay, I'm going to start by just looking in the in general about how some ways that we're talking about climate change. I'm going to focus on metaphor. For those of you who don't know about metaphor, I'll give some examples later and we'll walk through how that works. I'll also talk about some experiments, some cognitive work, and a little discourse analysis work too, that shows how climate change or climate language, is the way we talk about climate change is important to how we think. There's a direct relationship there. And then also how we might do better. That's what we want to walk away with today, is what are some of the implications of the work I'll talk about. My work is just a small smattering of methods, theories, approaches we can use to think about, talk about climate change. I hope that all of you will go on, or that other people who will continue to work on this, because there's so much work to be done. My work just touches on it. And then we'll leave a little time for question and answer. So I got interested in the language of climate change and how we're thinking about it quite a long time ago. About 10 years ago, the University of California, 10 different campuses in that system. I was at the new campus, UC Merced. There was an interest in thinking about and wanting to do more with climate change. So they brought together 50 faculty from different fields, more from engineering and the sciences, but there were some of us who were social scientists or humanists, to work all together and put together a little volume and collection of thought pieces on how we're thinking about climate disruption and things like that. And so I was on this article with Anthony Barnotsky, who's a well-known biologist who studies climate change, a political scientist. I think there was a medical person, there was a wildfire expert. And it was challenging to talk to each other at first. You know, there was kind of a feeling of, that's just language, you know, we don't study that, or as a scientist, it's not my job to teach my graduate students how to communicate. That's somebody else's job. They figure that out. And so there are a lot of gaps that started coming up, but that was very helpful to what we put together, and we were able to establish some common ground. And that sparked my interest, but going way back in time. And I want to thank George Lakoff for this. I was at a little conference, I think it might have been Conceptual Structure and Discourse and Language, one of the first ones way back. And I overheard some graduate students say, yeah, isn't that just too bad about George Lakoff? He's doing all this political stuff now, you know, he's focusing on language and society. We want to know more about, you know, conceptual metaphor theory. And I just remember sitting there and I thought about it, kept thinking about it for years, still thinking about it. I'm really grateful that he did that early work in politics, and he wrote a really lovely little paper many years ago about climate language. That work was very important, and it got many of us thinking about the value of doing that kind of work, not at the expense of good theoretical work. It actually informs good theoretical work. So I wanted to interject that now. Get off the soapbox. Okay, and then yeah, about 10 years ago or so, I did write a little article for American Scientist, just a general article on how we can frame political language a certain way. We can even manipulate grammatical structures, which to a scientist may not seem interesting or useful at all. But those of us who study language in depth, we know that grammar has meaning, that it too can influence people's attitudes and so on. But it was just a fun little piece I wrote to get people thinking about this. And then I went on to do some work on framing. And so for those of you who don't know a lot about framing, it's pretty simple. At least the way I look at it, or the way I'm using it in the studies I do, it involves a linguistic choice that we make. You know, so we use a particular linguistic form, whether it's metaphor, literal language, past perfect kind of aspect, or whatever it is, to convey meaning. And that can change people's attitudes in some cases. A lot of this work I've done with Steve Flusberg, who's a professor at Vassar. I met him when he was a graduate student at Stanford, social psychologist by training, but does a lot of work on language. And then some other colleagues as well. Kevin Holmes, who was also an undergrad at Stanford studying psycholinguistics. And then Robin Navi, who's a political scientist at UC Santa Barbara. And who am I leaving off? Paul Thibodeau, he's now in private industry, but did a lot of beautiful work on metaphor with Larry Bourdieu. So I've been working with people like these on framing. We have a new article coming out, I think it's later this year or the beginning of 2025, all about framing, and that's for psychological sciences for the public sector. So if you're interested in that article, I'll send you a copy of that in the coming months. Okay, real quick here. Let's look in the wild for a minute. How do we see framing in the wild? About what sort of metaphorical framing do we see about climate change? Well, let's look here. We see some violence language, right? The new climate war, the fight to take back. And then we have the planet's fight for life. So here the planet is fighting. And then the third book there from the left, the inside story of the battle against climate change. And then last on the far right, using NEPA to combat global warming. So we see a lot, and you can go look in any bookstore or look online, many popular books on climate change. regardless of what their fields are, they're using this kind of war language to talk about how we're managing climate change. And then sometimes that language can get pretty dramatic, pretty violent. The invisible killer, or the heat will kill you first, or global warming is a terrorist. There were a few book titles I didn't even feel comfortable showing, and it was interesting because some folks that are highly conservative and anti-climate change, they don't want to take climate action or believe in it, and they want to suppress, initiatives to help with climate change. Those titles are pretty violent, but the theme is slightly different. It's don't believe in climate change. A lot of progressives are trying to wreck your lives, and they're killing our planet or things like that. So I think it's a new framing and pretty violent language. A couple of book titles I saw. Okay, and then last, also you see a lot of information or reference to the edge, the world on edge, tipping points, on the edge of time. So there's this notion of an edge, and we all know that if you go to the edge of a cliff or something, you're going to fall. State change there. And then how does all this kind of language leave us feeling if we focus a lot on it? Pretty negative. We feel fragile. We feel unsettled. We have a lot of eco-anxiety. By the way, I was really happy to see in some of the information about this conference, acknowledgement of eco-anxiety. I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I'm in some workshops sometimes with people who are, and we generally try to think in a more optimistic, hopeful way about a lot of societal problems. And a major problem for clinical psychologists is more and more anxiety, secondary sometimes, about things like climate change. So it's a real problem. Also in the wild in general, the kind of language we're seeing and using, things like this, we're losing the war on climate change. There it is again. The world is losing, or why AI could be our best soldier in the war on climate, or join warriors. So who's fighting that war? Sometimes referred to who are the agents doing it. And then at the bottom, 10 ways you can help fight climate crisis. By land and sea, the Maori are using indigenous knowledge to combat climate change. So again, a lot of war metaphor kind of stuff. So there is this, you can call this sort of metaphorical thinking and way of being, managing climate change as a war. And then similarly, there are other metaphors too. One other popular one you see is the race against climate change. So thinking about motion moving forward through time, or sometimes as climate issues and changes and adverse outcomes coming your way. There's a lot of detail there on how we perceive motion from two different ways. And then at the bottom, racing ahead, why climate change innovation isn't just about technology. So if you look at social media, if you look at the news on the TV or newspaper headlines, you'll see a lot of stuff like that. Very common. I'm just going to say a few words about metaphor, how metaphor works. How many of you, would say you're not a metaphor expert, raise your hand. Okay, so this will be useful, and presumably for some people on Zoom too. So metaphor is not in just the language, it's not just in poetry and novels or things that we read or hear, novels we read, things we hear. Many of us over the past several decades, again, sort of spurred by, excuse me, some of the work that George Lakoff and others have done, Eve Sweetser, Barbara Danziger. The essential idea is that you have a basic domain of knowledge or experience that is used to structure something that's often more complex, new, difficult to navigate, very simply stated. There's a source domain that contains that more basic stuff, and it gets mapped onto or recruited to help us think about more complex things, etc. So that's essentially how it works. Those of us who have worked on metaphor in cognitive science and in cognitive linguistics, we definitely don't see metaphor just in a sentence or in a word. There is a strong war framing, so you can use metaphor to, and not even we can use, we do all the time. We talk about climate change and other, many other things in terms of a war. It might be a relationship, it might be battling cancer. I've actually done some research on how cancer patients in Spanish and English talk about their battle with cancer with my collaborator, Dalia Magana. Information about war structures how we talk about and think about other things. So in that purple circle up there, the source domain, the more basic domain, there might be feelings or thoughts related to competition, conflict, enemies, winners and losers, violence, damage, destruction, carnage, strategizing too. And then with the race framing, we saw a few examples of those earlier. There's some sort of goal in that basic body of knowledge, motion, path, points in time, racers, winners and losers again. So the information here, it's a little bit different from a war, but some of the things are the same, requires energy, and that. So very, very common metaphor, see it in politics all over. And pointing towards the election day and things like that. Okay, just take a minute here or a second here and give myself some water. We're gonna make a transition here. We're gonna move towards some cognitive studies I've done on metaphorical framing and how they affect reasoning about climate change. So I did this study again with Steve Flussberg and Paul Thibodeau. I mentioned them earlier. We wanted to study how metaphors for war or race would influence how we think about climate change and the environment. And we published this little paper in Environmental Communication, very preliminary, but we found some interesting things. I'm going to go through this a little bit fast because I want to focus on some other more methods details later. So there we have that war framing again, mentioned it already. Things like battling against detrimental outcomes or fighting against excessive energy use. We gave people, and I'll show you the paragraph in a minute, some subjects saw a paragraph that used that kind of language. And then we gave other subjects a paragraph that had a race framing, things like moving towards detrimental outcomes. So same information in a way, but then a different way. Detrimental outcomes are coming our way. That was another way thing we looked at. The main interest here were, do people believe that government efforts to reduce their national carbon footprint are realistic and achievable? Urgency and risk, we were interested in that. And then behavior change. People, could we tell if people were willing to change behaviors? So we gave a paragraph about with a word framing, all the same number of words, all the same information, except the metaphorical framing context, and then a race framing. We also gave a control condition, but we won't worry about those details right now. It turned out to not be very interesting in the end. And then the questions we asked, they were a lot of questions, but I'll just tell you about a few of them. We asked about urgency. So if you were a participant in the study, you read the question after the paragraph, one of the paragraphs related to urgency. How urgent is it for the US to implement energy reduction programs right away? Answered that question. It was a Likert scale. Or risk perception. To what extent are you concerned about the following potential consequences of climate change? And then last, this one got at this targeted willingness to change behavior. Would you be willing to pay a carbon offset cost to purchases of items derived from fossil fuels? Sorry. And we had a lot of findings. There were a lot of variables. But here's one meat and potato outcome. Total potato outcome. Speaking of framing. We found that in general, using that war metaphor encouraged people to view change as more urgent and more risky, and to change their behavior. So it was a more robust metaphor to use. And this is interesting. Let me say something about this. I went off in the weeds just for a second, but I'll come back. There is some research out there or literature, and some of you may know this well, Susan Sontag and so on in the health literature. Some folks say like, don't use a battle metaphor, please. No war language, no violence. That's really bad for people. It's traumatic. Yes, most certainly. But sometimes, this is some of the work I've done, we've found that when you feel, for example, with cancer, when you feel like you have soldiers working with you in a team and you're working towards a deadline, they're supporting you in this battle, it can be a good thing too. You can feel very supported. So it depends how you're using it and expressing it. And a lot of violence, of course, is bad. So in the political realm, if you're talking about political candidates, when you use a lot of negativity, a lot of violence, it'll turn people away. You know, can't deal with this. I don't want to hear about it. So there is this fine balance. I don't know what that is. That'll be things that we all need to study in the years to come. Okay, so that was on climate change per se. I've done some other work that focuses more specifically on wildfire language. And I wrote up a little paper called Monster Wildfire a few years ago with Chelsea Coe, a political science PhD student and a wildfire expert named Leroy Westphal. And we were interested in how and why people, hope this works, use this phrase.
This in California, where a monster wildfire is creeping further into the iconic Yosemite National Park.
As a monster wildfire.
A monster wildfire.
A monster wildfire.
Monster wildfire.
Monster wildfire.
Monster wildfire.
Monster wildfire. A monster wildfire is raging out of control near Yosemite National Park in California.
Okay, and so what I noticed in the news headlines, I was seeing monster wildfire a lot, and I grew up just outside Yosemite National Park. I'm actually from an indigenous tribe in that area, as Kim mentioned, and I started seeing this phrase all the time referring to fires in California. And then I looked at some fires in Australia, same thing. You know, fires all over the world are often referred to in this way, sometimes a beast too. And I thought, wow, high agency, and why is that happening? Okay, uncertainty. You know, when there's a lot of uncertainty, we don't know what's coming our way or what we're getting into. We're going to feel a lot of anxiety. And so we studied in depth this metaphor, wildfire is a monster. A lot of statements like a monster wildfire swallowing up everything in its path. So as a monster, it's not just the word monster, but what the monster does. So it devours, it destroys, it swallows things, it spits things out, it marches. It doesn't sashay though. It doesn't manage the emotion verbs. It's ruthless, it's marauding, it's a killer, things like that. A lot of violence language with this monster. And there were a couple of references in one data set I looked at that referred to it as Godzilla or King Kong. very, very colorful language like that. We wanted to see in a little discourse analysis study we did, how and when is this metaphor used? How does it influence reasoning about wildfire? That was the main thing we were interested in, easing into this. Let me just look at the time. Okay. And so we analyzed, there's a TV news archive you can find online. Some cognitive linguists use this to look at natural language in the wild and see patterns and so on. And so we looked at many statements, 124 statements in total that use this monster wildfire phrase, and we wanted to see what was going on. One thing we were interested in, when was monster wildfire mentioned in a TV news report? So like the one you saw, a man was sitting at a desk and then starting to report. Well, my intuition was right on this one, our intuition rather. 92% of the time that phrase appeared in the first sentence, right at the beginning of the story. think about that for a minute, it draws attention like, oh, what's that? You know, I want to hear about this. And so heavy framing on that. So things like a monster wildfire in Colorado or monster wildfires creeping into the iconic Yosemite National Park. And then it would go on to say, you know, what the fire was doing, how many acres were burned, and things like that. We were also interested in agentivity. How often was the monster wildfire, when there was a fire situation, doing the action? How often was it firefighters, residents in a community, things like that? 76% of the time, the fire was active and doing a lot of the action that was being referred to. And then, yeah, I've been wanting to tell firefighters that result. Okay, and then what kinds of actions were these monster wildfires doing in the little data set we had? Well, they were burning, destroying, expanding, threatening, being very angry. So there's a lot of metaphorically expressed emotion, which was great. It fits with all of this, the whole schema. And then they were threatening. They were even like preying on humans, following humans, being forceful, doing a lot of actions like humans and animals. By the way, this is something Tyler Margettis, another cognitive scientist I work with, we're actually, we have a little paper that's under review right now that focuses a lot on these specific actions. Stay tuned. And then we also did another part of our study included what kinds of images were shown with this monster wildfire in each case. So I thought it was interesting that it was always a dynamic image. So I remember in one video clip, it was President Obama, and he was looking at a large picture of a monster wildfire on the wall. So that was, you know, one of the two or something that didn't show it, but it was always dynamic, dramatic, you know, and things like this. Camera going into the fire, watching it progress, things like that. So what does that suggest and show? It shows that there's a lot of interest in the dynamic aspects of a monster wildfire. We also went on to do some behavioral work, cognitive work in the lab, actually online. We had UC Merced undergraduates, we asked them a little bit about their past. Many of them were familiar with fires because in California we have a lot of fires. They read a passage about a wildfire and then they answered some questions. There were two conditions for our experiment. In one case, there was a metaphor wasn't highlighted. There was no metaphor. So the statements same in both conditions, except one had metaphor, one didn't. So with the no metaphor condition, it had the statement, this major wildfire, the metaphor was this monster wildfire, burned many acres, eaten up many acres, burned several houses, swallowed, and so on. So they read a paragraph like that, then afterwards answered 4 simple questions. How many acres were burned in the end? Open-ended question. How many homes were destroyed in the end? How many lives were lost? Would you choose to evacuate? And if you were in this situation. So the questions here got at risk, urgency, willingness, things like that. So for the first one, how many acres were burned? I mean, this was really dramatic. An average of 2,900 were with that metaphor framing. So people, you know, major wildfire versus monster had that dramatic of an effect. Question 2, how many homes were destroyed in the end? There was also a reliably significant difference here when people were exposed to that metaphorical framing with monster wildfire. They were more likely in general to say that, or to give a higher number for homes being destroyed. And then how many lives were lost, if any? It was more in the monster wildfire framing. And then last, would you choose to evacuate if you were in this situation? And the answer was, for this one, yes, they were more likely to choose to evacuate. Study 2C, so we also use the same approach, but remember the big long paragraph I showed you? I think when we initially submitted this paper, reviewers said, yeah, but come on, you really loaded up the manipulation of life. Of course, you know, it's gonna tip people. So we thought, well, let's strip it down to very short passages. So the only difference was major wildfire versus monster wildfire. And we found very similar results. So how many acres were burned in the end? More with monster. How many homes were destroyed? More with monster. How many lives were lost, if any? Here, there wasn't a difference. There was a trend, but it wasn't a significantly statistical difference. And then 4, would you choose to evacuate if you were in this situation? So once again, people reported they'd be more likely to evacuate. So in summary, metaphorical information influenced reasoning about these wildfires that were in progress. So this was a situation where they were in progress, including how damaging fires are and whether or not to evacuate. I'm also very interested in, just pause for a second, in situations where we're reasoning about why we should clear fuels off our land, why we should support government initiatives that help us take better care of the earth and protect it from these horrific fires happening. Many of them are relating to like lightning storms. So however they're caused, arson, whatever it is, they're going to be far worse and more likely to be a monster if the land hasn't been cleared and if good, you know, things haven't been done to take care of it and so on. So I'd love to do more work in that area in the coming years, or see more of you do that. All of this is related to climate change in that there's overgrowth of plants and all excessive droughts and so on. It's another example of extremes we're seeing. I am gonna skip this study because I'll go over time if I do it, but I'll be happy to tell you about it on the break or something. And it's not directly related to climate change. It's more another method you could use. Let's see. Time for questions. So some closing remarks here that we'll walk through together. Back at the very beginning, when I'm starting my talk, I'm talking about a problem with language, framing, climate change. The way we talk about climate change affects how we think about it. And then ultimately what our willingness is, you know, how open we are to thoughts and actions. This is also the solution, so we can do good work, good reporting, have good discussions, have events like these where we all come together and talk about these things. They're important. The language really isn't separate from the thought. You gotta look at them together. We need to also, in this, not mutually exclusive, it's part of it, find better ways to establish common ground with people. When I did my postdoc training at Stanford University many, many years ago, I worked with Herbert Clark. Some of you who are interested in language, especially in conversation and natural discourse situations. He made a huge contribution to cognitive science, psychology, linguistics, by showing that I have a mental model and certain things I want to say or do, and you have a mental model, and we talk to each other so those can at least be there. There's an approximation. Can't map them exactly. They can't be identical, but my views of climate change, can I convince another person or at least talk to you about better initiatives we can build together? So common ground is extremely, extremely important. I can do little studies in the lab all day, but it's meaningless if I'm not out talking to people and working on what's best I can, sharing ideas. And if we're restricting ourselves to political boundaries and as advisors, if we're not allowing our students to work on environment sorts of languages or issues, things like that. So common ground is super important. Also, this could be a whole conference on this, or many talks. Language, when we go really negative, a little negative is good. A lot of work in social psychology on this. When we're a little negative in politics, climate change, whatever the topic is, it'll capture our attention. Why? Because we're humans and we have a little anxiety prone, you know, we come from generations and generations where people or things might be out after us or might be harm or damage. So we're mindful of these things and our feelings and our thoughts. So negative will always capture attention, but when it's, you know, excessive all the time, we tune out, turn off the TV, close the computer. Oh, that's rubbish. I'm not going to pay any attention to it. So in our messaging about climate change, it's very important to think about this. We don't want to chastise others too much. We want to try and establish common ground the best we can. It's not easy. Events like this are great for that. We also want to, this one's really important, tear down barriers. Another thing I noticed 10, 12 years ago when I started thinking more about some ways that we can talk to each other a little better about climate change and how are people thinking about it. I noticed in the literature, there was very little on how do we talk to farmers, you know, low income people, someone from a different country, an immigrant. And I remember at these events with the other UC professors and administrators, when we were talking about it, University of California initiatives and so on, there was kind of a, you know, people saying, oh yeah, I guess you're right. We should be talking to farmers and people in the community. And fortunately, I haven't published this work on this myself, but there are more and more countries across the world, more and more people talking to refugees, immigrants, farmers, people who, you know, are on the land, have things at stake, and more voices are being heard. And the more we can do this, the better, of course. So yeah, universities that have initiatives to go into the community and do research, it's all great. As advisors, we should be encouraging our students when it makes sense, or early career faculty when it makes sense, and they can extend their research in that direction a little bit. It's all good. And then on a more personal note, Kim mentioned that I'm Southern Sierra Miwok. My lineage is with that tribe in the Yosemite area. A few years ago, there were no initiatives like this. You know, people in my tribe would say, yeah, people never talk to us about clearing brush, and we've been doing it for thousands of years, you know. And gee, we'd like to do some of our cultural practices again, burning and clearing land, but we're not allowed to. Yosemite National Park won't allow us, or you know, county officials won't allow us. Well, that's changed. Luckily, at least in my own universe where I'm from, now there's a lot of donors give money to this program for Southern Sierra Miwok to do the cultural burning. It's becoming very popular. Other tribes are doing it in California and presumably, I really don't know if it's well or what's going on. But I do know it in my own community. And the nice thing too is many of the people doing the work are young women. They're getting out with their kids, and the kids are learning how to do this critical cultural practice that helps the environment, makes it safer for all inhabitants in that area, whether they're, you know, part First Nation or not. So it's been great. It's just been so exciting to see this develop. And California, CAL FIRE, which is a fire agency in the state of California, they even work with this and support it, which is fantastic. So we are lowering those barriers, getting the job done, which is. I want to end on a word of hope. I listen to a lot of books on how we can be more optimistic, how we can be more grateful, more hopeful, and these kinds of things. And Arthur C. Brooks, he has a lot of books out there. His most recent ones, the last 2 or 3, they're great little self-help books, and they have some good messages in there. One of the points that he makes is that, yeah, there's hope, and that's more critical in a way than just thinking positive or just being open to thinking optimistically about something. Why? Because when we hope, we can, we think there's a possibility here. We can actually take action. You know, something might change. I could contribute to this. Whereas optimism and some of the other positive language we use, it might be kind of just more dreamlike or ephemeral, things like that. So, you know, I'm not a lexicographer who studies the differences in meaning between these words, but hope is the right way to frame this, and we can all boost hope, encourage others to be hopeful, I think, thinking hopefully. Last, I really want to thank you for coming today, both people who are on the Zoom part of this meeting and the people in this room. I want to thank Kim for her introduction. I want to thank Elise Stickles and this university for having this event. It's a wonderful event. And I want to thank my collaborators, students, mentors, George Lakoff and others, Barbara Danziger, Eve Sweetser, people who have done really a lot of heavy lifting on what metaphor is, what it does, and other crucial components of everyday language. And thank you very much.